The morning of March 7th, 1945 began like every other morning on the western bank of the Rhine. Cold, gray, smelling of diesel smoke and frozen mud, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from one bad night, but from months of them stacked on top of each other without relief. Second Lieutenant Karl Heinrich Timmerman stood at the edge of a ridgeline overlooking the small German town of Remagen and tried to understand what he was seeing. Below him, through the thin morning haze, the Rhine moved dark and fast, swollen with snowmelt from the Eifel Highlands. It was wide here, wider than most men who had never seen it imagined. Nearly 1,000 feet of cold-moving water, deep enough to swallow a tank whole, fast enough to carry it downstream before the crew could open a hatch. Across that water, Germany waited, and spanning the gap between them, still standing, impossibly still standing, was the Ludendorff Bridge. Timmerman had been told bridges didn't exist anymore. Every commander from Eisenhower down had quietly accepted that the Germans would destroy every crossing over the Rhine before Allied forces could reach it. That was doctrine. That was logic. Bridges were the one advantage defenders always held. You blew them. You bought time. You forced the enemy into costly river crossings under fire. Every German engineer, every Wehrmacht commander understood this. The Rhine was the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland, and its bridges were its locks. And yet, here was a bridge, not a small footbridge, not a ruined shell, a full rail and foot crossing, nearly 1,000 feet long, its 2 stone towers rising above the water like medieval gatekeepers, its iron lattice framework intact, its deck apparently passable. Timmerman's company commander, Captain George Seitz, had radioed to find up the chain of command minutes earlier. The response came back fast, and the message was essentially this: don't get excited. It's probably mine. It'll probably blow before you get near it, but go look anyway. The unspoken part of the message, the part everyone understood, was that nobody at higher headquarters actually expected the bridge to be there by the time anyone reached the riverbank. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why a single standing bridge sent shockwaves all the way to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, you have to understand what the Rhine crossing was supposed to look like. Allied planners had been preparing for it for months. It was to be one of the largest set-piece military operations of the European War. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been planning his crossing, codenamed Operation Plunder. With a meticulous care, he gave every major undertaking. It involved 2 full armies, thousands of boats, engineer bridging units, massive artillery preparations, airborne drops, and an infrastructure buildup that required moving mountains of equipment across Belgium and the Netherlands. The crossing was scheduled for late March. It was expected to cost thousands of casualties. The Rhine was not a river you simply drove across. It was a military problem measured in men and months. And Karl Timmerman was looking at a bridge. He was 22 years old, born in Frankfurt, Germany. As it happened, his father had been a soldier in the First World War, and the family had emigrated to Nebraska. When Karl was an infant, he had grown up in the American Midwest, graduated high school, entered the Army, received his commission, and found himself in the winter of 1945 leading a rifle platoon at the sharp end of the American advance through the Rhineland. He was not a famous man. He was not a general. He was not the kind of officer whose name appeared in newspaper dispatches. He was the kind of officer the American Army produced in enormous numbers during the Second World War, competent, steady, and possessed of a quality that is genuinely difficult to manufacture in a training environment. He did not panic easily. The story of Remagen properly begins not in March of 1945, but in the specific military situation of the preceding weeks, because the bridge's survival was not an act of German negligence. It was a result of a collapse so rapid, so total, and so unexpected that it outran the Germans' own plans for destruction. The Allied offensive in the West had shattered in the aftermath of the Ardennes. Following the failure of the German counteroffensive, what Americans call the Battle of the Bulge, the Wehrmacht's condition in the West had deteriorated with remarkable speed. The divisions that had attacked through the Eifel in December of 1944 had expended their last reserves of armor, fuel, and trained manpower in that gamble. When it failed, there was nothing comparable left to replace what had been lost. By February of 1945, German forces west of the Rhine were being rolled up at a pace that surprised even optimistic Allied planners. Cologne, Germany's fourth-largest city, fell on March 6. American armored columns were covering distances in days that had taken weeks during the autumn fighting. The German command was attempting to conduct an ordered retreat to the Rhine, blow every crossing, and establish a coherent defensive line on the eastern bank. But ordered retreats require order, and order was precisely what the Wehrmacht west of the Rhine no longer possessed. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had been built during the First World War, completed in 1918 specifically to move troops and equipment to the Western Front. It was named for General Erich Ludendorff, the German quartermaster general who had pushed for its construction. It was a heavy rail bridge designed for military and industrial loads, with 2 stone towers on each bank housing stairways, rooms, and defensive positions. Its approach tunnels on the eastern bank, the Erpler Cliff, were hollowed out and could shelter troops and equipment. It was, by the standards of First World War engineering, a serious piece of military infrastructure. By March of 1945, its military value had become almost entirely defensive in one sense, as a target to be destroyed. The Germans had already wired it with demolition charges. The officer responsible for its defense and eventual demolition was Captain Willy Bragg, who had been given the unenviable task of holding the bridge with a force that was, by any honest assessment, inadequate for the purpose. Bragg had a mixed command, some regular Wehrmacht soldiers, some Volkssturm, the late war militiamen too old or too young for normal service, some engineers responsible for the demolition, and a collection of stragglers from units that had been shattered in the retreat. The force had no armor to speak of. It had anti-aircraft guns positioned on the towers in the surrounding area, but these were designed to engage aircraft, not tanks rolling up a road. Against a determined armored thrust, Bragg's garrison was a speed bump. The demolition plan was straightforward. When the Americans appeared in force, blow the bridge and deny the crossing. The charges had been placed. The mechanism was prepared. All that was required was the order and the execution. What the Germans did not account for was timing. The American unit that stumbled upon Remagen on the morning of March 7th was the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, specifically the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. They had been advancing rapidly eastward. Their orders for that day focused on seizing high ground south of Remagen. The bridge itself was not their objective. It was Sergeant Alexander Drobick, moving with a reconnaissance element forward of the main column, who first reported what appeared to be an intact bridge. The report went up to Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engelmann, commanding the 14th Tank Battalion, who moved forward to see for himself. Engelmann pushed the information immediately to Brigadier General William Hogue, commanding Combat Command B. Hogue was a practical man. He looked down at the bridge. He looked at the retreating Germans streaming across it. He looked at the charges almost certainly attached to every pier. And he made a decision that was, by strict interpretation of his orders, entirely unauthorized. He told his units to take it. The authorization from higher command came scrambling after the fact. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, reached Hogue within the hour and gave his blessing. But by then, Hogue had already committed. By then, Timmerman was already moving. What Timmerman faced as he prepared to lead his men onto the bridge was not simply a matter of crossing exposed ground under fire, though that was certainly part of it. It was a specific, visceral reality of advancing onto a structure you had every reason to believe would be detonated beneath your feet before you reached the other side. The Germans attempted their demolition at approximately 11 in the morning. The engineers triggered the first charge. There was a detonation, significant, visible, throwing debris and smoke into the air. The bridge shuddered. Its deck rose slightly, planking erupting in places. And then it settled. It did not fall. The main demolition charge, the one designed to drop the central span into the Rhine, had malfunctioned. German accounts differ on the precise reason. Some sources cite a problem with the primer cord. Others suggest the charge itself was faulty. Others point to a direct hit by American tank fire that severed an electrical lead. What is certain is the result. The bridge was damaged withstanding, its structural integrity compromised but not destroyed, its deck broken in places but potentially passable. The Germans triggered a second, Smaller charge. More smoke, more shuddering, more debris. The bridge listed slightly, and still it stood. From Timmerman's position, the events on the bridge looked different than they do in retrospect. He could not know that the main charge had failed. What he saw was explosions on a bridge he was being ordered to cross. What he heard was the crackling of anti-aircraft fire from the towers overhead, German small arms from the far bank, and the sound of his own men looking at him waiting for the order. The order, by any conventional military calculation, was a suicide order. The bridge was under fire from multiple positions. Its deck was damaged and potentially unstable. German troops were visible on the far bank and in the tunnel entrance beyond it. The span was nearly 1,000 feet of exposed ground with no cover, no concealment, no ability to maneuver, and no ability to retreat cleanly if the structure gave way beneath you. The doctrine said you did not cross a bridge under these conditions without thorough preparation, without suppressing the defensive positions, without engineering assessment of the structure's integrity, without artillery support, without smoke screens, without the full architecture of a prepared assault. Timmerman had none of that. What he had was time. Specifically, the complete absence of it. Every minute that passed was another minute for German engineers to correct whatever had gone wrong with the demolition. Every minute was another minute for reinforcements to reach the far bank. Every minute was another minute for a higher German command to discover that Remagen had not been destroyed and to redirect whatever resources were available toward remedying that failure. The window was not hours. It might be minutes. Timmerman turned to his platoon leaders. 3 of them were standing near him, waiting. Sergeant Joseph Delisio, Sergeant Mike Chinchar, Sergeant John Reynolds. He told them they were crossing the bridge. He told them to move fast and spread out, because a spread formation meant the same burst of fire couldn't kill them all at once. He told them to keep moving regardless of what happened. Then he stepped onto the bridge himself. First. He stepped onto it first. This detail matters in ways that transcend military ceremony. In the specific psychology of combat, men follow men who demonstrate what is possible, not men who describe what is required. Timmerman did not point at the bridge and tell his soldiers to cross. He walked onto it in front of them, and one by one his men followed. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What followed during the next 10 minutes on the Ludendorff Bridge belongs to a small category of military actions that are almost impossible to convey adequately in language, because their defining quality is not dramatic in the conventional sense. It was not heroic in the cinematic manner. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was men forcing themselves to keep walking forward across exposed ground while fire came from multiple directions and the structure beneath their feet groaned and swayed, knowing that the only variable separating them from death was whether a German engineer with a detonator was close enough to a working fuse to press it before they reached him. German fire from the towers was heavy at first. Anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, rifles. The American response was immediate. Pershing tanks and tank destroyers on the western bank opened fire on the towers, hammering the gun positions. Smoke began rising from the eastern tower. Engineers with Timmerman's force went to work on visible demolition wiring as they advanced, cutting cables where they found them, trying to sever the demolition network faster than the Germans could repair it. Delisio's squad moved forward under fire, passing craters where the failed charges had detonated, stepping over damaged planking, keeping low, keeping moving. The rate of German fire from the towers diminished under the weight of American tank fire from the western bank. Delisio reached the far tower, entered it, and began clearing it floor by floor with his squad. German soldiers inside, some surrendering, some fighting, were dealt with in the close, immediate way that stairwells demand. Timmerman crossed. His men crossed behind him and beside him, platoon by platoon, moving as quickly as they dared across decking that was in places buckled and broken, the Rhine dark below through the gaps. The far bank grew closer. Timmerman reached the eastern end of the bridge and stepped onto German soil at approximately 12:26 in the afternoon of March 7, 1945. He was the first American officer to cross the Rhine under combat conditions. He was 22 years old, from West Point, Nebraska. His father had been born in Germany. The far bank was not secure. The tunnel entrance in the Erpeler Lay Cliff was still holding German troops. fire was still coming from multiple positions. The situation on the bridgehead was confused, close, and dangerous. But the bridge was in American hands. Back across the Rhine, the telephone lines to higher headquarters were burning. The message traveled up through Combat Command B to 9th Armored Division, to 1st Army, to 12th Army Group, to SHEF in Paris. At each level, the initial reaction was almost identical. Disbelief, followed by the rapid recalculation of everything that had been assumed. General Omar Bradley received the news from Hodges and later described his reaction in his memoirs. He wrote that it was one of the luckiest breaks of the entire war. He authorized Hodges to push across everything he could, as fast as he could, before the Germans could either destroy the bridge or mount a counterattack strong enough to throw the Americans back. Bradley then called Eisenhower. Eisenhower was at his headquarters in Reims. The call came through in the evening. Eisenhower later wrote that when he heard the bridge was intact and Americans were across, he made his decision instantaneously. Push 5 divisions across as fast as possible, establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank, and exploit whatever the situation allowed. The formal crossing of the Rhine, the one with the boats and the airborne divisions and the artillery preparations and Montgomery's meticulously staged operation, was still weeks away. But the Rhine had already been crossed. An unauthorized, unplanned, tactically improvised assault by a lieutenant with a rifle platoon had done what months of planning had expected to cost thousands of lives. The Germans understood what had happened before the Americans did. General Alfred Jodl, the Wehrmacht's chief of operations staff, received the news at Hitler's headquarters and reportedly went pale. Hitler's reaction was incandescent. He demanded to know who was responsible for the failure. He demanded courts-martial. He demanded executions. 4 German officers were eventually court-martialed and 3 were shot, though not Bragg himself, who was a prisoner of the Americans and thus unavailable for a particular form of German military justice that Hitler was dispensing in the spring of 1945. Hitler had understood, even in the midst of his fury, what the bridge meant. The Rhine had been his last serious defensive line, not because the river itself was impassable. It had been crossed by armies throughout history, but because forcing it against prepared defenses would have required time, resources, and a sustained operational pause that might have allowed some fragment of the Wehrmacht west of the Rhine to escape and reconstitute. Now there was a bridgehead, a small one, precarious, under constant counterattack, supplied by a single damaged bridge. But it was there, and it was going to grow. The Germans moved faster than anyone expected. Within hours of Timmerman's men reaching the eastern bank, the Wehrmacht's response was already being organized at levels that reached directly to Hitler's headquarters. This was not a localized tactical problem to be handled by the nearest available unit. The Remagen bridgehead was an existential threat to the entire German defensive strategy in the West, and everyone from field commanders to the Führer himself understood it with a clarity that sometimes comes only when catastrophe has already begun. The German 7th Army, responsible for the Remagen sector, had almost nothing immediately available to throw at the bridgehead. The collapse of the Western Front in the preceding weeks had shattered unit cohesion across the entire theater. What should have been organized divisions were instead fragments. Companies separated from their battalions separated from their regiments, all of them moving east in various states of exhaustion and disintegration. The Americans were pushing across the Rhine before the Germans had finished retreating to it. But Germany in March of 1945 was not yet finished. It was dying, but it had not yet accepted death. And a dying military organism, when pressed hard enough at a single point, can still produce remarkable violence. The first serious German counterattacks against the bridgehead came on the evening of March 7 itself, within hours of the crossing. German infantry, scraped together from whatever units could be redirected, probed the American perimeter on the eastern bank. The terrain worked partially in the defenders' favor. The Erpler Lay Cliff, the great basalt hill rising directly from the Rhine on the eastern bank, compressed the bridgehead into a narrow strip and made large-scale armored assault difficult. But it also meant the Americans were hemmed in, unable to expand rapidly, fighting in close terrain against an enemy who knew it well. General Hogue pushed every available unit across the bridge through the night of March 7th into March 8th. Engineers were continuously on the damaged deck, shoring up the sections weakened by the failed German demolitions, laying timber over the worst gaps, reinforcing the approaches. The bridge was never more than marginally passable. Tanks crossed it one at a time, slowly, while engineers watched the structure and prayed. The deck swayed. The towers had been damaged by both American tank fire and the demolition attempts. Every loaded vehicle crossing, it was a calculation of how much more the structure could absorb. The Americans also immediately began building supplementary crossings. Engineer battalions arrived and began constructing tactical floating bridges. Standard military pontoon bridges of the kind American engineers had perfected during years of training and combat in Europe and the Pacific. These were not elegant structures. They were functional ones, designed to carry traffic under fire, capable of being assembled in hours by trained crews working in darkness, cold, and periodic artillery fire. By March 8th, the first supplementary bridge was operational, and the flow of men and equipment across the Rhine accelerated. Hitler's response to Remagen operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and understanding it requires understanding the particular character of German military decision-making in the final year of the war, when Hitler's personal involvement in tactical decisions had become total and the results were consistently catastrophic. He ordered the bridge destroyed. This was not a new order. The bridge was already supposed to have been destroyed. What he meant was that it should be destroyed now, regardless of the means required, regardless of what it cost. The Luftwaffe was ordered to attack. This was, in March of 1945, an order that revealed the distance between Hitler's directives and the reality of German air power. The Luftwaffe that responded to Remagen was not the force that had blitzed Warsaw and Rotterdam in 1939, or even the force that had contested the skies over Britain in 1940. It was an organization that had been bled to near exhaustion by 4 years of attrition, that was desperately short of fuel, that had lost most of its experienced pilots, and that was flying against an American air defense umbrella that had grown formidable. The Americans had anticipated air attack and positioned anti-aircraft units in depth around the bridgehead. When the Luftwaffe came, and it came repeatedly over the following days, it flew into a wall of flak that was among the densest concentrations of anti-aircraft fire assembled in the Western Theater. American fighter patrols added another layer. German aircraft attacked in ones and twos and small groups. The days of mass formations long passed, and were met by curtains of fire that extracted a severe toll. Over the 10 days of the bridgehead's existence, the Luftwaffe flew more than 300 sorties against the Remagen crossing. They sank some of the pontoon bridges temporarily. They damaged equipment. They killed men. But they did not destroy the Ludendorff Bridge, and they did not stop the flow of American forces across the Rhine. The cost of the Luftwaffe, already operating on the margins of viability, was severe. Nearly 30 German aircraft were shot down over Remagen. It was, in the mathematics of a dying air force, a cost it could not absorb repeatedly. Hitler then turned to weapons that his imagination and the propaganda of the previous years had convinced him were decisive. The Vergeltungswaffen, the vengeance weapons. 11V. 2 ballistic missiles were fired at the Remagen Bridge. This was the first and only time in the Second World War that V-2 rockets were used against a tactical battlefield target. The V-2 was a remarkable piece of engineering, the world's first operational ballistic missile, capable of traveling from its launch site to its target in approximately 5 minutes, arriving faster than the speed of sound and therefore without warning. It was a weapon that could not be intercepted, could not be heard coming, and could not be defended against by any means available in 1945. Against a city, the V-2 was a weapon of terror. Against a bridge, it was almost useless. The accuracy of the V-2 at that stage of the war was, by any honest assessment, poor. The guidance technology available in 1945 could place a V-2 within a circular area of error measured in miles, not yards. Firing 11 missiles at a target the size of the Ludendorff Bridge, from the distances involved, was less a precision strike than an expensive gesture. All 11 missiles missed. Several landed in the Rhine itself. Others struck the surrounding area, killing Belgian civilians and destroying structures nowhere near the crossing. Not one struck the bridge or any of the American pontoon bridges alongside it. The German army also deployed frogmen, combat swimmers tasked with attaching explosive charges to the bridge piers from underwater. Small teams entered the Rhine upstream from the bridge and attempted to drift down to the structure under cover of darkness. The Rhine in March is cold, fast, and unforgiving. American engineers and infantry along the banks have been warned to expect exactly this and had taken precautions. Searchlights, patrol boats. Depth charges dropped periodically into the water around the bridge piers. Most of the German frogmen were captured or drowned before reaching the bridge. None successfully placed a charge. The mission was, in retrospect, a measure of the desperation that had overcome German planning by this point. Not a serious military option, but a gamble born of having no serious options remaining. Artillery was more effective. German batteries on the heights east of the bridgehead maintained intermittent fire on the crossing throughout the 10 days, striking the bridge itself several times and inflicting steady casualties on the engineers working to maintain it. The damage accumulated. The Ludendorff Bridge, already weakened by the failed demolitions of March 7th, absorbed additional structural injury with each artillery hit. Inside the bridgehead, the fighting was brutal in the specific way that small unit combat in close terrain always is. The Americans were expanding their perimeter yard by yard against German units that were fighting with the particular ferocity of men who understood what the bridgehead meant. Every hill, every village, every road junction on the eastern bank was contested. German counterattacks came in at night and at dawn. Infantry pushing through the pine forests of the Westerwald try and compress the American perimeter back to the river's edge. They failed. They failed consistently. But they failed at a cost, and the cost fell on the young men of the American infantry battalions, who were holding the bridgehead's perimeter while the engineers worked and the armor crossed and the staff officers at higher headquarters watched their maps and recalculated the possibilities the bridge had opened. Timmerman himself remained in the bridgehead, leading his company to the fighting on the eastern bank. He was, by all accounts from the men who served with him, the same officer he had been before the crossing. Undemonstrative, steady, competent. The kind of leader who communicated confidence not through rhetoric but through presence and example. The war, for him, did not pause to acknowledge what it had done on March 7th. There were positions to take, perimeters to hold, and the ordinary grinding demands of combat that continued regardless of historical significance. The bridge lasted 10 days. On March 17, 1945, at approximately 3 in the afternoon, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the Rhine. The collapse came without the sharp warning of an explosion. The structure simply failed. The accumulated damage of the original German demolitions, the artillery strikes, the continuous passage of heavy vehicles across a deck that had never been designed for the weight of American tanks, and the stress of 10 days of continuous use finally exceeded what the bridge could bear. The central span fell, dragging sections of the structure with it. The great iron lattice disappearing into the Rhine, in a grinding, tearing cascade that those present described as sounding like nothing so much as the tearing of enormous cloth. 28 American engineers were on the bridge at the moment of collapse, performing repair work. 28 men went into the Rhine. Rescue operations began immediately, but the river was cold and fast. 3 men were pulled out alive. The rest were swept away. Their names were added to casualty lists of a war that had been generating casualty lists for nearly 6 years, and the machinery of the Allied advance continued without pausing to mourn them in any organized way, because in March of 1945 machinery could not pause. But by the time the Ludendorff Bridge fell, it no longer mattered. The supplementary pontoon bridges had been carrying traffic for days. More crossings downstream were already in operation or being prepared. The bridgehead on the eastern bank had expanded from a narrow strip of ground Timmerman's men had seized on March 7th to a perimeter 8 miles wide and 4 miles deep, held by 5 American divisions with more crossing every day. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, the great set-piece crossing that was supposed to have been the definitive moment of the Rhine campaign, launched on March 23rd, and found itself crossing a river whose psychological barrier had already been shattered 2 weeks earlier by a 22-year-old lieutenant from Nebraska who had stepped onto a damaged bridge because there was no time to wait for permission. The military significance of Remagen operated on 2 levels, and it is worth separating them carefully because they are genuinely distinct. The tactical level was real, but bounded. The bridgehead at Remagen was not, by itself, the decisive blow that ended the war in the West. It did not immediately produce the breakout that some enthusiastic accounts suggest. The terrain on the eastern bank, heavily wooded, cut through with streams and hills, was not ideal for rapid armored exploitation. The bridgehead remained a relatively contained operation for its first several days, and the main Allied thrust that encircled the Ruhr and drove deep into Germany came through other crossing points and along different axes. What Remagen did at the tactical level was force the Germans to commit their last reserves of mobile troops and firepower against the bridgehead at exactly the moment when those reserves might otherwise have been used to strengthen their defenses against the crossings that followed. Every German unit thrown into the counterattacks against Remagen was a unit unavailable to contest plunder. Every Luftwaffe sortie burned against the bridgehead's air defenses was a sortie unavailable elsewhere. The bridge drained German capacity at the moment German capacity had the least to give. At the strategic and psychological level, Remagen mattered in ways that transcended the immediate military calculation. The Rhine had not simply been a river. It had been a symbol, perhaps the central symbol in the German conception of national defense. The Rhine had been the border between Germany and the threats beyond it for centuries of European history. It was embedded in German culture, in German music, in the mythology the Nazi regime had spent 12 years reinforcing. German soldiers had been told, explicitly, that the Rhine was a last line, that it would be held, that the Allies would break themselves against it. When the Americans crossed it at Remagen without the massive preparatory operation the Germans had expected and prepared for, the psychological impact on German troops along the entire front was significant, not decisive alone, but part of the accumulating weight of evidence that the war was lost, evidence that could no longer be denied by the men carrying rifles in the Westerwald. Eisenhower understood this. He had authorized 5 divisions across the bridge almost in the same breath in which he was told about it, and the speed of his decision reflected not only tactical calculation, but an understanding that moments of this kind, moments when the enemy's psychological framework is cracking, are the moments of press, to commit everything, to deny the adversary the time and space to recover his footing. The men who were responsible for Remagen did not receive, in the immediate aftermath, the recognition that history would eventually assign them. Hogue was reprimanded. This remarkable fact deserves to be held for a moment and examined. The general who had seized an intact bridge over the Rhine, who had handed Eisenhower a strategic gift of incalculable value, received an official reprimand from his division commander for acting without orders. The reprimand was later withdrawn, quietly, without ceremony, by officers who understood that the historical record would not be kind to anyone who had officially punished a man for what he had done. But the initial instinct of the institutional army had been to discipline a commander who had improvised successfully, because improvisation outside the chain of command is uncomfortable for institutions regardless of its results. Timmerman was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. He received it. He was not given the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, though subsequent historians and veterans have repeatedly argued that the action at Remagen met and exceeded the criteria for it. The decision was not reversed during his lifetime. He came home after the war, returned to Nebraska, and lived a life of a returned veteran. Work, family, community, the ordinary texture of existence that millions of men who had done extraordinary things in 1942 through 1945 quietly resumed. He did not seek public attention. He gave occasional interviews when historians or journalists found him, answered their questions with a matter-of-fact brevity that characterized his generation's relationship with their own wartime experience, and returned to his life. Carl Timmerman died on October 13, 1951. He was 29 years old. The cause was cancer. He had survived the Rhineland, Remagen, and the final campaign to Germany, only to die in an American hospital 6 years after the war ended. Younger than most men are when they begin the careers that will define them. He is buried in West Point, Nebraska, not West Point, New York, the academy, but the small town in the Nebraska Panhandle where he had grown up, where his father had brought the family after leaving the Germany of the Weimar Republic for the America of the 1920s. The grave is marked with a simple stone. The Ludendorff Bridge, or what remains of it, still stands at Remagen today. Partially, the 2 stone towers on the western bank were preserved after the war and converted into a peace museum. The bridge itself was never rebuilt. The ruins of the eastern approaches remain visible from the riverbank. The ironwork truncated where the central span collapsed into the Rhine on March 17, 1945. The museum inside the towers holds artifacts from the crossing, equipment, photographs, the personal effects of soldiers on both sides. It receives tens of thousands of visitors each year, Germans and Americans and others, people who come to stand on the riverbank and look across the Rhine and try to calculate, looking at the width of the water, what it meant to walk out onto a damaged bridge under fire with no certainty that the structure beneath you would still exist in 10 minutes. What made Remagen possible was not superior equipment. The Americans had no advantage in technology at that crossing. The Ludendorff Bridge was German-built. The rifles in German hands were as capable as the rifles in American hands. The terrain favored the defender, as terrain at river crossings almost always does. What made Remagen possible was a sequence of human decisions, each one made in the absence of certainty, each one made under pressure time that allowed no extended deliberation. Hogue looked at a bridge and decided to take it before asking permission. Timmerman looked at a bridge he had been told would blow beneath him and stepped onto it first. Delisio and Chinchar and Reynolds followed their lieutenant because he was already moving, and there was no time to do anything except move. Engineers cut demolition wires in the dark, while German fire came from the towers above them. Tank crews drove their vehicles across a deck that groaned and swayed because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant the window closed. None of these men were operating from a position of confidence. They were operating from a position of committed uncertainty, the specific state of mind that combat at its hardest requires, in which you understand the risk clearly, you accept that you cannot eliminate it, and you act anyway because action is the only variable you can control. The experts had said the Rhine would cost months and thousands of lives to cross. The plans had been drawn for a massive, deliberate, set-piece operation involving armies and airborne divisions and bridging equipment measured in miles. All of that planning was serious, was professionally sound, and was rendered partially irrelevant in 10 minutes by men acting without a manual for the specific situation they were in. There's a version of the story that treats Remagen as pure luck, the right unit in the right place at the right moment, benefiting from a German demolition failure that could as easily have succeeded, and luck was present. It is always present in war. The demolition charge failed, and that failure opened a window that would not otherwise have existed. But windows do not take themselves. The window at Remagen was open for a period measured perhaps in minutes before German engineers could have corrected whatever had gone wrong. Hogue saw it and moved. Timmerman stepped through it. The window was luck. What happened inside it was not. The bridge plan had been called suicide. The men who called it that were not wrong about the risk. They were wrong about what men will do when they understand the risk, and decide that crossing is still worth it. I'll add approximately 500 words, woven naturally into the script's closing section, expanding the legacy and reflection before the final CTA. Here is the enriched ending, replacing everything from what made Remagen possible onward. What made Remagen possible was not superior equipment. The Americans had no advantage in technology at that crossing. The Ludendorff Bridge was German-built. The rifles in German hands were as capable as the rifles in American hands. The terrain favored the defender, as terrain at river crossings almost always does. What made Remagen possible was a sequence of human decisions, each one made in the absence of certainty, each one made under pressure time that allowed no extended deliberation. Hogue looked at a bridge and decided to take it before asking permission. Timmerman looked at a bridge he had been told would blow beneath him and stepped onto it first. Delisio and Chinchar and Reynolds followed their lieutenant because he was already moving and there was no time to do anything except move. Engineers cut demolition wires in the dark, while German fire came from the towers above them. Tank crews drove their vehicles across a deck that groaned and swayed because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant the window closed. None of these men were operating from a position of confidence. They were operating from a position of committed uncertainty, the specific state of mind that combat at its hardest requires, in which you understand the risk clearly, you accept that you cannot eliminate it, and you act anyway because action is the only variable you can control. It is worth pausing on what the men crossing that bridge actually knew in the moment. They knew the bridge had already been blown, at least partially. They had watched the charges detonate. They had seen the deck rise and buckle. They knew with certainty that German engineers on the far bank were almost certainly working to correct whatever had failed. They knew that fire was coming from the towers, from the far bank, from positions they could not fully identify. They knew that if a second successful demolition occurred while they were on the span, there would be no rescue from the Rhine in March. The water was too cold, the current too strong, the chaos too complete. They knew all of this. They crossed anyway. There's a tendency, when looking back at moments like Remagen across a distance of 80 years, to flatten the men involved into symbols, to make Timmerman into an archetype of American courage, rather than a specific human being with a specific weight of fear pressing against a specific decision made on a specific cold morning in the Rhineland. The flattening is understandable. It is how memory works at the scale of nations, but it caused something important, because what actually happened at Remagen is more instructive than the symbol and more honest. Timmerman was afraid. Every account from the men who were with him confirms this. Not because he showed it openly, but because every man on that bridge was afraid, and any account that claims otherwise is not describing combat, but inventing a more comfortable version of it. What distinguished him was not the absence of fear, but the decision he made while carrying it. He calculated the odds, found them terrible, and stepped forward anyway, because the mission required it, and because his men were watching, and because there was simply no more time. That combination, clear-eyed assessment of danger, refusal to be paralyzed by it in movement, is the closest thing to a formula that Remagen offers. It is not a comparable formula. It does not resolve into a clean lesson about confidence or preparation or leadership principles that can be extracted from the mud and cold and terror of the original event and applied cleanly elsewhere. It is simply what it was: men doing an extremely difficult thing under the worst possible conditions because doing it was necessary and because someone had to go first. The experts had said the Rhine would cost months and thousands of lives to cross. The plans had been drawn for a massive, deliberate, set-piece operation involving armies and airborne divisions and bridging equipment measured in miles. All of that planning was serious, was professionally sound, and was rendered partially irrelevant in 10 minutes by men acting without a manual for the specific situation they were in. There's a version of the story that treats Remagen as pure luck, the right unit in the right place at the right moment, benefiting from a German demolition failure that could as easily have succeeded. And luck was present. It is always present in war. The demolition charge failed, and that failure opened a window that would not otherwise have existed. But windows do not take themselves. The window at Remagen was open for a period measured perhaps in minutes before German engineers could have corrected whatever had gone wrong. Hogue saw it and moved. Timmerman stepped through it. The window was luck. What happened inside it was not. The bridge plan had been called suicide. The men who called it that were not wrong about the risk. They were wrong about what men will do when they understand the risk completely, weigh it honestly, and decide that crossing is still worth it. They were wrong, specifically, about Karl Timmerman, a young man from Nebraska, born in Germany, who walked onto a broken bridge over the Rhine and changed the course of the last campaign of the war in Europe, and who was dead at 29, and who is buried in a small town most people have never heard of, beneath a stone that says nothing about bridges. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.